Well, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to another scintillating, didactic, and provocative session of business and its environment. How are our graduate students today? Are we hooah? I certainly hope so. Well, let's see. Life in Bermtown is looking a little wintry. We got snow headed our way, so we got our Huskies out there taking the students from class to class to class, building to building. We don't want anybody to miss a single minute of our fabulous education. And so it doesn't matter what the weather is, USD will continue to teach, teach, teach. And so today I've dragged myself in here despite the 6 feet of snow out there and the weather conditions, but we're going to have an exciting conversation today about the changing workplace, boys and girls. One of my favorite books is Alvin Toffler's book, which is all about, change. And so I highly recommend it to you, Toffler. I think what Alvin has tried to tell us is that there is one constant in life, and that constant, in fact, is change. Your introductory discussion about the Ford Motor Company, I think, is a historic example of what we're talking about. Because we know, of course, Ford was the first true assembly line manufacturing automobile company. And yet, by 1927, Ford was used to doing things their own way. In fact, one of their favorite sayings was, well, you could have a Model T in any color you want as long as it's black. And so Ford was inflexible in the marketplace. And so other automotive companies were created to compete with Ford. And as a consequence, by 1927, Ford had been surpassed. And they ended up having to lay off over 100,000 workers. Excuse me. Well, can you imagine what that looks like? 100,000 workers in 1927 being laid off from one company. But hey, Ford fought off attempts to unionize its workers. Henry Ford was determined that it was, my way or the highway. Well, guess what? By the time we arrived into the 1980s, well, Ford had completely undergone a massive reorganization of work, not only for its hourly employees, but also for its salaried managers. Why? The Japanese automobile industry was eating the American automobile industry's lunch. And so I think Alvin Toffler's book called Future Shock is something I highly recommend to all of you, because while written in the 1970s, I think the points that he makes in his book Future Shock very well apply today. And that the only constant in the business world is change. Yeah, I think he's right. I think he's absolutely right. So certainly not just Ford, but all of American industry face global competition. And I like to argue that competition is a good thing. Competition keeps prices low and quality up. And when you don't have competition, I think prices tend to go up and quality tends to go down. There's just no incentive to work hard. And I think competition requires that. And that's a good thing, I submit. And so I think, you want to encourage and demand, competition in your economy. So let's bring us up to about 2008, and I think we could all agree we had a economic and financial crisis. I strongly encourage you to take a look at YouTube and watch the movie Too Big to Fail. Also, The Fed. Um, Money for Nothing Inside the Federal Reserve is another YouTube movie that I strongly encourage you to take a look at, because we not only, of course, had a financial crisis involving investment banks who were investing in risky mortgages with FDIC insured bank accounts. We had perhaps people might consider it overreaching by labor demands. So specifically in the automobile industry at our three big plants, GM, Chrysler, and Ford, we had the American auto unions were negotiating hourly wage contracts of $70 to $75 an hour with benefits, while their competitors, Honda and Toyota, were making cars in Birmingham, Alabama, and other places in the South, but only paying their workers $40 to $45 an hour. So could we agree that the automobile industry was becoming non-competitive, or as we like to say in the economic world, they were at a competitive disadvantage, and that Honda and Toyota were doing very, very well, but paying a lot less. So, so what happened in 2008? You will recall, as President Bush was leaving office, the Chrysler and GM's executives flew in their private jets to Washington, D.C., and they wanted to get some government guaranteed loans so they could upgrade their automotive operations. Well, President Bush wisely said, well, look, President-elect Obama is coming in. This is a problem that he needs to deal with. It would be unfair for me to make decisions that are going to impact his administration. And so what did the Obama administration do when it came into office in January 2009 to these executives? It said, look, you created this problem. What you all need to do is you need to take your companies into bankruptcy in order to liquidate your indebtedness and reduce your expensive labor contracts. And by the way, you may want to sell your corporate jets. So, of course, what happened? Well, the executives flew back and then took commercial airlines to come back to Washington to request government guaranteed loans. And to their credit, the Obama administration held its position and said, you need to take your companies into bankruptcy. That's the legitimate place to go for unloading your debt and canceling your contracts, which your labor contracts especially, which are making you, competitively disadvantageous. Well, why do you think members of the board of directors and chief executives and all high rollers at Chrysler and GM, why do you think they steadfastly refused to take their companies into bankruptcy? What do you think? Why the opposition? Might it be the legal fact of what happens to the company's stock when it goes into bankruptcy? Do you know what happens to company stock when a company goes into bankruptcy? It gets zeroed out, right? It gets zeroed out. It is worth absolutely nothing. Well, how much stock do you think the executives and the board of directors at Chrysler and General Motors, now Ford did not go into bankruptcy, but why do you think, how much stock do you think those executives all had in their companies? Like a gazillion shares, and they would have lost all of that, would have been zeroed out, no matter how many millions of dollars of company stock they had, it would have been reduced in value to zero. It gets wiped out completely in bankruptcy. Oh my, so you can begin to see their resistance? Well, they inevitably were going to go into bankruptcy. That was certainly inevitable because of the competitive disadvantage of these companies. Well, eventually, of course, the shareholders and all, everybody got excited and said, okay, the business thing to do is to go into bankruptcy and eliminate the indebtedness and renegotiate the very expensive labor contracts with the automobile workers. And oh, by the way, the Obama administration said, as a condition for our guaranteed government loans, all of the executives, all of the members of the board of directors, all of you have to go because you drove your companies into bankruptcy. Your leadership and management clearly is making your companies non-competitive. You need to go. And so those companies ended up getting new management. And how are they doing today? A heck of a lot better than 2008, for sure. So clearly competition mandated a reduction in labor costs. There are actually 6 factors today that shape the workplace, and we're going to dive into those. The first one certainly is the demographic change in the United States labor force. We have about 154 million workers, and it's changing. Well, how is it changing in the sense that it's affecting the workplace? Well, while it has been growing at a whopping 1.1% a year, the growth has been gradually slowing. It's becoming, and I think most of you already know this, quite diverse. Hispanics, Asians certainly are entering the workforce more so than whites and blacks. Women are finding more and more positions in the workforce than ever before. And then there's the problem of the baby boomers. Who are they? Well, folks who are 68 years of age. Oh, could that possibly be moi? We're aging? Well, what happens when we age? Come on now, I don't want to hear any criticism out there. I look a very youthful, what do you think, 26, 27? All right, at the outside, 28. But we, baby boomers, we are retiring. We are leaving the workforce. We are now going to start enjoying our well-earned Social Security and other types of retirement investments. That, of course, leaves room in the workforce for replacements, right? We've got to be replaced. And that, of course, historically is what immigration has been doing for the United States labor force. Is immigration has kept us competitive and kept our workforce at close to full employment. A second factor that is affecting our economy today and our workforce are technological changes. Nothing particularly new there, right? I think all of you already knew that. That, hey, are you kidding? Technology is here to stay, and it's like increasing exponentially every year. And it certainly affects working conditions and the number and type of jobs that are available out there. Ask the auto industry. Wow, robotics has really had an enormous impact in the automobile manufacturing industry. The whole computer software industry, holy cow, it's taken off and will continue to expand and grow. How about this? The conversion of 7.6% of the labor force that has been transformed from agricultural work to now industrial work with just the introduction of mechanical harvesters. Let me give you another example. When I was in Poland for a year on a Fulbright lectureship teaching at the Jagiellonian University Center for American Studies, in 2000, Poland obviously had exited a few years earlier from the Warsaw Pact and, of course, the communist system, but now they wanted to join the European Union. But how about this interesting statistic? Agriculture provided only 5% of Poland's GDP, gross domestic product. Yet, agriculture employed over 50% of Poland's workforce. So let me give that to you again. You got 50% of the population producing 5% of the GDP. I think most reasonable people would say, that doesn't sound very efficient. And in terms of economic factors, that's not a good thing. And so the European Union said, look, Poland, we're not going to take you in to the European Union until you start restructuring your economy and industries. And having 50% of your workforce employed in agriculture that produces only 5% of your GDP, hey, this isn't going to work. And we're not going to take on a welfare state into the European Union. So clearly, automation has exploded in Poland, and it certainly has in the United States. So yes, has there been job loss? Ask the steel industry. Has there been job loss? How about the coal industry? So less skilled manufacturing and service occupations have certainly seen their demise. But we've seen the explosion of new jobs in the service industry and certainly in the computer technology industries. A third factor that affects our workforce involves structural changes, like the one I just gave you with respect to, with respect to Poland. So, switching from agriculture and goods producing, that is manufacturing industries, to more service occupations, that transition has been growing. So the agricultural sector in the United States has declined to only 1.4% of our U.S. labor force, down from 90% in the colonial times. So I think we all can appreciate transition, right? So even goods producing, that is the manufacturing area of our economy, that used to employ 34% of our workers in 1950 is now down to only 14.2% by 2008. Does that look to you like a trend? I think that looks like a trend to me. It looks like, feels like, walks like, talks like, and statistically is a trend. So what are service sector occupations? Well, a lot of those now add value to manufactured goods. So whereby we employed 40% of the workforce in the service sector in the 1950s, ta-da! Today, we employ 77%. You think that's what growth looks like in the service sector? So, and certainly we've had different trends, right, depending in different, fields. So we certainly have had long-term job loss in agriculture, but we've had resulting long-term gains in the service sector. Investments, finances, banking, hey, service sectors, right? So certainly the decline of the manufacturing, sector has led to the decline in unions, to the point that only 7.2% today of private sector employers are being represented by, or employees are being represented by unions. So the future for unions doesn't look all that bright. Certainly, we would agree as a fourth factor affecting the workforce that competitive pressures have intensified. So when you ask anybody, whether domestic or international business people, Ask them, so how's the competition? Has it slacked off in your area? I think as a norm, those people will tell you exactly the opposite. The competitive pressures are intense. And certainly with increasing deregulation, growth in foreign trade, which we're having an enormous debate about now, has brought about faster new product development and certainly consumer pressure for better service. Now, we talked last week about consumerism, and that it's really an ideology. And when you have an economy like ours in the United States that is based on consumption, not exporting, our economy is based on our domestic consumption. Americans buying stuff. Well, customers govern the marketplace, and of course, they are constantly demanding new product development and better service, right? Better service. So the whole online sales industry certainly has been a response to consumer demand. Frau Huck, my wife, she is forever buying stuff on Amazon Prime. I am forever trying to get her off that, but I am fighting a losing battle. How about this one? In terms of competition, high wage versus low wage countries, hourly compensation in manufacturing in the United States was at like $33.53 an hour. But in India, it was only $1.17 an hour. That's what international competition looks like. So if you can buy a widget in India that costs only 10% of what a widget costs in the United States, what are American consumers going to do? Walmartians, you're probably going to buy the cheaper product that it's made overseas, right? A fifth factor affecting the workforce involves certainly reorganization by corporations. So we talked previously about environmental, changes, and so companies have learned, sometimes through the process, school of hard knocks, that the environment, harming the environment can be bad for business in the short run and in the long run. So certainly there has been a change in the relationship between time and space, with faster communications and cheaper transport out there in the world of not only manufacturing, but certainly in the service industries. We all have heard the term outsourcing, when a company decides, well, instead of making bolts and screws for our automobiles internally, we're going to get a contract supplier to do that for us. Oh, but what happens to all those workers that made the bolts and screws? Well, either they transition to new types of jobs in a company, or they look for work elsewhere. Let me give you a personal experience. When I was in the Pentagon in 1989, we were just introducing computers to the Pentagon. And the thinking was, well, the introduction of computers in the Pentagon is going to eliminate all the secretarial positions in the building, all the administrative assistants and all that used to do typing and filing and all this type of work. Well, we're going to be able to save an enormous manpower load, so we can lay off a lot of people, right? Wrong? While we did certainly implement computer technology throughout the Pentagon, which has over 25,000 workers in that five-sided foxhole, guess what? Nobody got laid off. Why did nobody get laid off? Because all of these secretaries, administrative assistants found other types of work to do. So I found that, interesting, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. But when you decide on the bottom line that you're definitely going to reduce the budget, and you can do that by outsourcing work, companies are not shy about doing it, right? We've been having a conversation about offshoring for some time now, trying to bring back steel, for example. My bet would be that's not going to happen. There are just certain types of manufacturing and production that is economically better to be performed overseas, and that it financially is better for a company in the United States to, offshore, that is, transfer the work to a foreign location or a foreign supplier. Now, granted, why that may not be politically a fun action to take, hey, numbers drive the game, right? A sixth factor affecting the workplace and the workforce certainly involves government intervention. So we used to have historically, going back to the 1800s, for example, a laissez-faire economic, policy in which, look, the government should not be getting involved in business, and that the relationship between workers and employers should be something that should be worked out between those two parties without interference from the government. Well, we know in the 1920s and 1930s, times changed. And with the enactment of labor laws, in fact, today, we're up to like 225 major statutes affecting rights of employees. Times have changed. And so the government has certainly involved itself in labor management relations. So not just the Taft-Hartley Act, but certainly OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. We've got lots of governmental agencies and federal laws, not to mention a plethora of state laws that affect the workforce, such as, when employees are injured. States are required to provide disability insurance for all employers, for employees who are injured on the job. Employment at will, which you hopefully have heard the term before now, is a legal point or legal principle that simply says, look, management can let go of workers with no notice at all, and workers can quit without any notice at all should they decide to do so. Now, unless they have a written contract that specifies or provides otherwise, employment at will means, hey, everybody can come and go. Well, what's the impact of that on the labor force? Well, certainly we know a lot of our service workers are employees at will. And so management, in order to maintain flexibility, lets employees go. So, for example, after Christmas, lots of people in the retail industry get let go after Christmas because there isn't the demand for the services of more employees that exists, obviously, during the pre-Christmas season. Now, we do have sometimes labor contracts, but as we mentioned earlier, only 7.4% of the workforce today is represented by unions. The vast majority are not. Unless you have a contract that specifies otherwise, you can be, let go and with little or no notice. But, we do have some law that do protect employees in specific situations, like employees can't be let go if they're complying with public laws and policies. So, for example, if an employer instructs an employee to engage in an unsafe labor practice, that would certainly violate OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And the employee can legitimately say, no, I'm not going to dump that toxic waste out back. That's against the law. Oh, you're fired then. Nope. Wrong. You can sue your employer for a wrongful termination because of the public policy exception. And if employees are promised permanent employment, it used to be that employers would say as long as employees complied with all the policies in the personnel human resources handbook, they would be provided continuous employment. Nobody does that anymore, and I'll leave that to your imagination. Why not? And there is, of course, an implied covenant of good faith that employers have a duty to be fair to workers and cannot dismiss a worker for unjust reasons. Now, I refer you to state employment laws because there is a plethora of them that protect benefits and workers in this area. And so, as a general norm, workers in developed nations have more sophisticated labor protection rights than do others in undeveloped or less developed countries. So, while some people may think in an employment at will situation that employees can be dismissed for good, bad, or no cause reasons, as I mentioned, there are state laws that introduce a number of exceptions that limit an ability of an employer to let a worker go. Japan is probably at the other end of the spectrum, where workers receive good and lifetime compensation and lavish benefits even into retirement in exchange for unwavering loyalty of employees. And so many companies, your larger ones, even have health programs, where exercise programs, where the whole workforce an hour before work starts has to be out there engaging in Tai Chi and other types of health benefiting exercises. Why? Because there's an enormous amount of data to show exercise, non-smoking, and so forth will reduce your health claims and expenses. In Europe, labor unions have a fascinating relationship with employers. So let me take, for example, Volkswagen, for example, an international company whose headquarters is in Wolfsburg, Germany. There are members of the union who sit on the board of directors and vote on the board of directors at Volkswagen. So clearly the unions are in bed with the company, because what happens to the company certainly happens to the labor force. Well, what's the impact of that? Well, Germany has along with a number of other European Union countries, have a requirement that if you're going to lay off a worker, you have to give the worker a minimum of 6 months' notice. And how about this one? You have to pay them a year's salary and benefits before you let them go. So if you're going to close a plant in Germany, what's the economic impact going to be in terms of laying off all those employees and all these benefits you're going to have to pay? Got to run that number, right? So labor unions are a force to be reckoned with. Clearly, we've done away with the old days of forced or compulsory labor. Child labor, of course, there are laws that govern and restrict that. And there's certainly restrictions on employment discrimination on the basis of race, age, religion, gender, and so forth. And of course, we have federal laws guaranteeing the right to collective bargaining. But again, we have so few, only 7.4% of the workforce represented by unions, and disappearing. That's going to be changing in time. So certainly there is a trade-off in labor regulation between protecting worker welfare and allowing market flexibility. Certainly employers want to be able to lay off on almost a no-notice basis employees so they can move manufacturing plants to more favorable areas. And so, we've seen that, and that obviously has created regional problems. as Michigan and Illinois have been experiencing. So you had in your text an interesting case involving Swift and Company, and we had a similar situation here in Sioux City at a plant that a meat packing plant that we had in Sioux City, where we had ICE conduct a raid. Now, clearly, no nation can open its borders to unregulated immigration. I mean, no nation on earth can afford to do that. And clearly, the more sophisticated and wealthy your economy and country is, the more it's naturally going to attract immigrants. So Europe has been a classic example, right? And we're still continuing the conversation here in the United States regarding unlawful immigration from Mexico. And of course, there have been numerous countries, certainly El Salvador, Colombia, Venezuela, and whatnot, where migrants have, come up through Mexico trying to get into the United States, seeking, refuge. So the Swift case, I think, is an interesting case to try and explain, what does the workplace dilemma, look like. All of you, when you have applied and taken a job and been made an offer, have to fill out the E-Verify and the Form 19s to demonstrate and prove that you, in fact, are a lawful American or someone with an approved green card. And so, the question comes up, well, is our current system fair, requiring employees, prospective employees, to, fill out and furnish proof of citizenship or legal immigration? And so that's been, the rule certainly since the 1980s, and E-Verify is an electronic system where employers can type in the social security number of a prospective applicant, and it'll indicate whether or not, in fact, they are, legitimate. But separate and apart from that, you still have to fill out Form I-9 and produce, driver's licenses and passports and other types of, proof. Now, I mentioned earlier about raids. We had a raid at this meatpacking plant in Sioux City, and I recall, they did police up quite a number of undocumented illegal aliens, but then they had to turn them all loose because they all had child care, right? They all had their children that were being taken care of child care providers. Well, what happens at 5 o'clock? Well, someone's got to be there to pick up the children. Well, if ICE has got their hands on all these unlawful illegal immigrants, what happens to the children? This created an enormous crisis when they had like 350 children that belonged to these undocumented aliens. This created a crisis. And of course, 350, that's a lot of kids. And we're obviously talking about, small children. So that created a massive problem. So ICE had to turn around and let them all go. Well, and of course, they all fled and disappeared and went, other places seeking employment. That's the problem, with raids. And so the question arises, are there other hiring and verification practices that can be undertaken that are less intrusive and more effective? And I think the Obama administration example of doing the audits, the field audits, made more sense instead of worksite, raids. But again, clearly, and now employers who hire illegal aliens can be fined. like it's $10,000 an offense. So there are penalties for employers who are essentially, breaking the law themselves by hiring or employing undocumented aliens. And undocumented aliens certainly have labor rights. And so can companies essentially pay them slave wages and not pay them the minimum wage because, hey, they'll turn them in, and if they don't work for the slave wage, well, that, as you rightly would be concerned with, is against the law, and even undocumented aliens are entitled to minimum wages and all of the health and safety laws and benefits that the law provides. So yes, the Immigration Reform and Control Act is the federal law that makes it illegal to employ an unauthorized worker. Now, in good faith, certainly companies are using E-Verify and I-19s to try and screen that out. But of course, there's a whole trade, if you will, an industry all by itself in creating forged documents to get past the I-9 and the E-Verify system. And as I mentioned, even unauthorized workers are protected by the Fair Labor Standards Act, because clearly exploitation, especially of undocumented aliens, is not only unethical, it is rightfully so illegal. Certainly, does enforcement of workplace immigration rules invite disrespect for the law? Well, we can, have a debate, on that. Clearly, why these people risk everything to come to the United States. These clearly are desperate, people. Even the American agricultural economy, California is a good example, desperately needs workers to work in agricultural jobs. And so there is this tension, if you will, between the need for agricultural workers and obviously the need for workers to find employment. And so it's an ongoing conversation, and it's one that Congress should have resolved and has been close several times before with bipartisan agreements. Almost got across the finish line, and then, for political reasons, the agreements blow up. I think these are going to continue to be conversations affecting the workplace that all of us need to be sensitive to and listen carefully, but to propose remedies as to how these situations may be addressed responsibly, most certainly for the illegal or undocumented aliens, but also for the American economy, that, we're virtually at full employment, and we need workers to, and we've been relying historically on immigration to fulfill the ranks of those like me who will be retiring in the foreseeable future. So these are the subjects I wanted to discuss today with respect to our changing workforce, because I think Alvin Toffler is right in his Future Shock, and I highly recommend that paperback book. The only constant in life is change, and change will continue to happen. So with that, as always, I invite your emails, your questions. If there's anything I can do for you, I'm just an email away. See you next week, gang. Bye-bye.